crowd knew that Jesus was coming.
But because Jesus convicts us and causes us to ask, is it I?
You got to be prepared. Prepare for your blessing. Be prepared for the anointing.
Well, let us open up our word this evening. We will turn to Luke chapter 22, verses 31 through 34. Again, if you're just tuning in to the stream and you're getting ready, we're just opening up our Bibles to Luke chapter 22, verses 31 through 34. And the word of the Lord from the New International Version reads, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. I'd like to lift up today as our sermon topic, leadership lessons. Will you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for another opportunity to break open your word, Lord. We just ask that you would open our hearts and our minds to hear what you would have us to hear today, Lord. We thank you for all of the wisdom that has been imparted this week during revival, and we just ask, God, that you would bring us a new, fresh word today, Lord. I ask that you would speak through me, that your children may hear you, and in Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right. Thank you all again for joining us for our last night of Holy Week this Thursday. If you are just tuning in, again, we just read from Luke chapter 22, verses 31 through 34, and we're looking at the topic, leadership lessons. What a blessing it has been to be filled by the word this week from 3 wonderful women, and then here I get to end us out in this Holy Week revival. As we are rounding out our Holy Week, I want us not to turn our attention just yet to Good Friday. I know we are all anxiously awaiting Good Friday because we can't get to Resurrection Sunday without death on Friday. But before we get there, I invite us to think about and to look at some of the events that have happened in this Holy Week. Jesus was pretty busy in this Monday through Thursday of Holy Week. He's, in just 4 days, cleared the temple. He's cursed a fig tree. He's spoken some parables. He speaks on the end times. He's anointed at Bethany. Judas betrays him, and he washes the disciples' feet. He has the Last Supper. These are just a few of the 40 things that happened in the last 4 days of Jesus' life. He was indeed busy. And as we center ourselves in this Maundy Thursday narrative, I invite us to draw our attention to the events of the upper room that evening. In Luke's version of today's text, Judas has already agreed to betray Jesus. The disciples have prepared for the Passover feast, and they've just had the Last Supper. The dispute about who is the greatest disciple has been squashed, and we find ourselves at Jesus now foretelling Peter's denial. I imagine the scene set before us as friends sitting around the table, enjoying each other's company, laughing, and, well, you know what we do when we sit around the table with friends. We probably cut up a little bit, too. Okay, definitely we cut up a little bit. After all, I mean, they did just finish asking Jesus who was the greatest amongst them. That feels like a little bit of cutting up to me. And while there was likely a sense of joviality at some point in the evening, the mood is likely shifting. Right? The room becomes a little bit more somber as Jesus begins to talk about the suffering that he will do, as he begins to pray for them, as he begins to wash their feet and talk to them about what happens next. The mood is likely shifting from that of a little bit of fun to probably a sober, very somber moment. He's imparting what I would argue are just the last few details he can offer to them before he goes to the cross and before he heads to the Garden of Gethsemane. And here he has saved Peter's denial for last. Jesus spends these last few moments with the disciples, giving them some leadership lessons that will carry them throughout their ministry. And this first lesson, and by far the hardest one to accept, is that leadership has challenges. The first leadership lesson that Jesus has to offer the disciples late on this Thursday of Holy Week is that leadership comes with some challenges. He speaks directly to Simon Peter, but the first words are for all of us to hear, those at the table and for those of us listening now. He says, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. We cannot afford to miss the word all in this text. Some versions leave it out, but here in the NIV it says, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. And it reminds us of two things. That one, Simon Peter wasn't the only one who would be facing some challenges this week. But also, it reminds us that there is a collective nature to challenge. When we are in leadership and in community with one another, there's some collective challenge that we all will experience. And while we focus here on Jesus' commentary to Simon Peter, the word all needs to help us keep in perspective that Simon Peter didn't work alone. He was part of a group, right? This wasn't David Ruffin and the Temptations. It's not Simon Peter and the disciples. It is simply just the Temptations, and it's simply just the disciples. Rather, the 12 disciples were a collective, a community of Jesus' close friends and followers, and none of them were exempt from Satan's desire to distract them. He asked to sift all of them. No one was exempt from this request. And while no one likes to find solace in temptation or trials from the enemy, can I submit that the early good news of the text is that they would all experience it together? Trial is communal in this sense, that challenges didn't come to just one disciple. It didn't come to just 2 or 3 disciples. All 12 of them were part of this challenge. And while it's difficult to celebrate our trials, can we take a minute early in the sermon to celebrate the fact that you aren't going through your trial alone? That if you are struggling today, there's likely someone else who's sitting in your house with you, who's sitting on the stream with you, who's also going through some challenge. Challenge is communal. It comes for all of us. But the good news is that you're not alone in your struggle. Being leaders in community together means that sometimes we're all going to be going through tough times. The lesson for us here in this text is that we have to bring that challenge back into community. The 12 disciples had one another to lean on and to turn to for support. God doesn't desire for us to struggle alone, but for us to be with those who we have cultivated close community with, for us to be with our church members, for us to be with our family and our friends. He doesn't desire for us to struggle alone in our challenges. And Jesus reminds Simon Peter of this in verse 32 when he encourages him to go back and to strengthen his brothers, that they all needed to be together. Going through challenges with your community should provide us strength, should provide us some wisdom, and some encouragement. We're often taught that we can't share our business with everyone, or that you shouldn't tell everyone everything that's going on with you. But I would argue that Jesus here tells us, as he uses these words of Simon Peter, that is to the contrary. That Jesus illuminates for all disciples present that Satan desires to sift all of them. And so if they are all to be sifted, they ought all be together as they are journeying through the process. He's publicly warning them all of the tough times ahead. And I would submit that he does so that they can turn to one another and to rely on one another as they're going through the challenge. Being a leader will have its challenges, but it doesn't mean that we have to face them alone. We can trust our community to walk through those tough times with us, but that means that we've got to cultivate good community to be able to do so too. And the beauty of going through challenges with your community is that everyone won't be experiencing everything at the same time. So while we may all be going through challenges, while you may be sitting on the stream and your neighbor on the stream is also going through a challenge, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be happening in the same place, that you'll be being challenged in the same area of your life, that you'll be challenged at the same time even. It may be me today and you tomorrow. It may be you on Thursday and then again another one on Saturday. The joy of this is that as we all are journeying together, we don't always have to be going through it at the same time. And this is most evident in how we see the disciples going through the end of Jesus' life. So from the time that Jesus talks to them here in this verse at 31 until verse 38, and then on to the ascension, they all go through challenges in one way, shape, or form. But it's not all happening at the same time. So some of them fall asleep at Gethsemane while Jesus is praying. One betrays him. They all scatter at his arrest. Some deny, and then some doubt. But they all happen at different points in the rest of the Holy Week story, telling us that while we may struggle and while it will hurt and while we do need community, the joy is that we don't have to all be having it at the same time. They all would be sifted by Satan in the coming days, but at different points. And the good news is that even though that would be the case, that they would be able to find one another in the end because they were in community. And because Jesus knew what lay ahead for them, he prayed for them. In Luke's gospel, Jesus tells Peter that he prays for him. But in John's gospel, Jesus prays for all of the disciples. Regardless of the challenges that they would face and regardless of how they would respond to Satan's attacks, Jesus prayed for and covered them. Jesus demonstrates that the most humble leadership skill in this moment is to just simply pray for his friends. He covers them in prayer for what he knows they will experience. And I love that about this story is that it's not about what they are experiencing. It's not about what they have experienced. But Jesus is praying for them before it even happens. And this is a good reminder for us that good leaders also do the work of covering those who they are in community with. That if you're not the one who's struggling right now, your job is simply to cover those who are. We don't need to know exactly what people are going through. We don't need them to tell us their whole life story, to just simply pray. Because we do serve a God who does know what they're going through. We serve a God who knows what's happening in their lives. And all we have to say is, God, we put them in your hands. Do what you can do. And we can have joy knowing that because God knows, God can cover. Jesus knew the outcome of Simon Peter's denial. He knew how Peter would feel and what it would do to Peter's heart to hear that rooster crow that third time after his denial. And Jesus knew that Peter's faith would be shaken. And so because of that, Jesus prays specifically for Peter's faith to be strengthened. I don't know about you this evening, but I know I am sure glad to serve a God who knows the outcome of my struggle and provides exactly what I need before it even happens. I'm glad that we serve a God who sees Satan causing us to doubt and covers us with faith beforehand, who sees Satan throwing hate our way and covers us with love. I'm glad to serve a God who sees Satan throwing us chaos and offers peace, to serve a God who sees and who covers. Jesus prays for Simon Peter before Satan has even begun his work. Instead of some reactionary covering, Jesus works proactively to pray for what Simon will need. Jesus provides this umbrella cover, right? That most of us, we wait until we start to feel the raindrops to put the umbrella up. But Jesus provides the umbrella before Simon even goes out into the rain. He says, here, you'll need this for later. You'll need this faith for later. So here, take it now. So when our faith comes under challenge, we're called to remember that we are covered, church. Just as Jesus covered Simon Peter in prayer, he covers us. Challenges may lie ahead for us, but we will not go uncovered or unprotected. And this text not only teaches us that leadership has challenges, it also teaches us that leadership requires growth. Jesus' statement to Peter in verse 32 is an interesting one. He tells Peter that he has prayed for him, that his faith may not fail. But when Jesus follows that up with, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Jesus doesn't issue this as a statement of possibilities. He doesn't say, if you turn back, or when you turn back. He says, and when you turn back, strengthen your brothers. He is sure that Peter will return. Simon Peter will stumble, but he will come back. And that is the good news of the text, right? That Jesus knows, that he knows that we will come back. Thank God for Jesus' omniscience to know what Peter would do and to know how he would respond so that he could encourage Peter. Jesus knows that he'll go back to his old habits. Jesus knows that Simon Peter will wallow, that he will be upset, that he will be in his feelings about what happens here. But he also knows that Peter will return to the fold. And Jesus tells Simon Peter this, perhaps as a reminder to us that sometimes God doesn't choose to interfere when the enemy attacks because he knows that the experience will be formative, but he also knows that we'll return. Jesus doesn't leave Simon Peter to struggle without some breadcrumbs that get him back to his outcome. The same can be said for us, that God doesn't leave us without breadcrumbs to know exactly how this will play out. It may be hard, but it is always encouragement for our growth. Satan's sifting ends up being a turning point for Simon Peter, but it's also an opportunity for growth. Jesus charges Simon Peter with some new leadership skills here as he tells him, go back and strengthen your brothers. That it's no longer time to just be the mouthpiece for the group, but it's time for him to do some hard work to be with his brothers, to strengthen them, to encourage them, to provide them with what they need post-Christ's death. So Simon Peter can't afford to wallow because he's got a job to do. He has to return to his brothers. They need him, and he needs them for support. So if Simon Peter can't afford to wallow, then that also means that we can't either. The other 10 disciples would need Simon Peter's faith and his encouragement. So it was imperative that he return to community. Our community needs us too. They need our joy, our peace, our love, our grace. They are counting on you to strengthen them. And so maybe the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is my community missing out on if I'm busy wallowing? I know it's a hard question. I know you want to turn the stream off now and not finish this sermon, but I do offer you, it's a question for us to think about. If I'm busy wallowing, then that means that someone is missing out on something. So what is our community missing by my choice to sit and wallow? Simon Peter knew that he needed to return because he was charged by Jesus, but also because he was given a job. So let me encourage you, if you found yourself in your wallowing season, you have a job to do. Feel your feelings, but you got to get back up and go back to your community. People are in need of your gift. People are in need of your story. They are in need of your light. They are in need of your encouragement. Your community needs you. So yes, you may have experienced a setback. That last battle with the enemy may have you feeling drained and more drained than you wish you were, but you are needed. Turn back and strengthen your brothers and your sisters. The ability to turn back is a sign of growth that Peter needed to be able to do as he begins to start the church, right? As he begins to be the mouthpiece later on. He needed that ability to turn back, to recover from setback. And so this moment and this opportunity that Jesus provides for him is a necessary moment of growth to say, go back, turn back, you can do it. Learn from your setbacks, but then make sure that you also carry that knowledge back to your community. And then we get to verse 33, and here is the problem part of the text for me if you're still following along. Jesus tells Simon Peter to turn back and strengthen his brothers, and Simon Peter responds, I'm going to prison and to death with you. Right? So Jesus says, you'll deny me, turn back, strengthen your brothers. And Simon Peter says, I'm going to prison and to death with you. Somehow the math doesn't math, right? That Jesus says, go back, strengthen your brothers. And Peter says, no, we're going to the end. It reminds me a lot of my son, Samuel, that I'll tell him, like, okay, you stay here. I'm just going to run to the back really quick and go grab something. And he's like, no, we're going together. And he's trotting along. I'm like, no, you sit and finish your lunch. I'm going to go do this for a minute. It is that very insane and special need that Peter had to be close to Jesus, right? That I think we often think about this moment is Peter just putting his foot in his mouth again, right? That he doesn't know what to say, and so he just says, well, no, here's my plan. I'm going to go to prison and to death with you. But can I submit that maybe another way for us to think about this moment is not so much that Peter just didn't know what to say, but that Peter didn't want to be without Jesus. Maybe it is just simply that he was so devoted to Jesus and the cause that he couldn't see anything on the other side of Christ's death. And so for him it was, well, I'm just going to go and do what you do because that's what we've been doing this whole time. The problem with this is that that's not what Jesus needs from Simon Peter right now. Growing as a leader calls for us to be where we are needed, right? It's not just about where we want to be, but about where we are needed. Jesus needed Peter to return to the other disciples, right? So that he could give them strength, that he could encourage them, and that he could lead them. Jesus needed Peter in place so that when Pentecost happened, he still had some work to do, right? That there was still some things that Peter needed. And if Peter went to death with Christ, then all of that is cut short. As leaders, we have to be able to recognize where we're needed. Our gifts and our skill sets are uniquely crafted to meet a need within our community. And so we have to be obedient to that, even when it takes us away from the calling that we want to have, right? Peter wanted to go to prison and to death with Jesus. That's the calling he wanted to have, but it's not the calling that he was actually given. We have to grow to a place where we are willing to follow the call that we have been given, willing to be stuck in the places that we feel like we are stuck in because that's where God has called us to be. Willing to do the work that we are called to do even when we don't want to because that's where we have been called to be. That is the true test of leadership and growth. And so not only does leadership require us to grow, lastly, leadership provides correction. In my sanctified imagination, I envision that verse 34 being one of the more difficult conversations that Jesus has had to have in this last week of his life. He's already wept over the city. He's issued some woes to the Pharisees, and he's also announced Judas's betrayal. And now he has to deliver what I can only imagine is crushing news to Simon Peter. Before the night is over, Simon Peter will deny knowing Jesus 3 times. Not Jesus' homeboy Peter, right? This is not the same Peter who walked on water. This is not the same Simon Peter who was on the Mount of Transfigurations. Not that Peter, right? It can't be that Peter. But it is, in fact, that Peter. And that's why I think that this conversation had to be hard. Because Peter rolled deep with Jesus. Peter was always with Jesus. Peter loved Jesus. But yet and still, Peter was going to deny Jesus. And even though it would have been some shocking news and probably heart-crushing news for Peter to hear, Jesus still has to tell him anyways. Here, Jesus is demonstrating for us that true leaders have difficult conversations, and they provide correction and clarity where it's needed. Jesus didn't allow Peter to leave the upper room moment not knowing what to expect next. Right, that Jesus could have just said, well, Peter will figure it out when it happens, right? That he'll deny me and he'll know, like, oh, that probably wasn't the best thing that he could have done. But Jesus doesn't let Peter walk out of the upper room without knowing what was going to happen. Right. That's the sign of a good leader. He provided some clarity for him. Peter was prepared to go to prison with Jesus and to die with him, but that's not where Peter needed to be. That's not his story for the evening. And so Jesus had to provide some clarity, knowing that this is where Peter thought he was headed, to say, let me fix you. Let me get you on the right course. There's no longer any need for Peter to wonder, as Jesus was saying, that Satan desires to sift all of you as wheat. Peter doesn't have to say anymore, well, what does that look like? Well, when is that happening? Jesus provides the clarity now and says, here, it is your denial. That is your sifting. Sometimes God has to deliver some heartbreaking news or some disappointing news, not just to break us, but to offer some clarity for what's ahead. And I know we often think about this as God gives us tough times to break us so that we can be where he needs us to be, or so that we can do what he needs us to do. But I would offer a different perspective here and say that sometimes the disappointing news is to provide clarity for what we have ahead of us. The door to that new job opportunity isn't closed because you weren't good enough. It's because God had a different direction for you. You're still in Ithaca, not because God wants you in the freezing cold in April, but because he has a purpose for you to complete here. There is still work for you to be done here. It is in the disappointing news that God is simply just providing some course correction. In the same way that Jesus provides course correction for Simon Peter, God's just offering us some course correction, even though it hurts, even though it's not what we want to hear. That is the sign of a true leader, that God is willing to have those conversations with us. And so maybe the question that we ask after disappointing news is, God, what clarity do you intend for me in this letdown? That's a really hard question, right? None of us want to ask that question. We want to say, well, God, why didn't I get it? Well, God, why didn't it happen? Well, God, why? And I'm not going to ask you to answer this question for yourself tonight, but I do want you to write it down and to think about it when you come to this next disappointing stage in your life, or when another letdown happens, to ask yourself, God, what clarity do you intend for me in this letdown moment, in this letdown season? What clarity are you providing? I would argue that clarity is why Jesus tells Peter what's ahead for him. And if you've been following your text with me, we notice that Jesus offers this subtle hint of clarity for Peter between verse 31 and verse 34. Jesus switches from referring to Simon Peter as Simon, as he calls him in verse 31, and begins calling him Peter in verse 34. When Jesus renames Simon in John chapter 1, Simon almost exclusively goes by Peter after that. Some scholars argue that Jesus only refers to Simon Peter as Simon when Simon's being disciplined, he's out of line, or he's being rebuked. But I would argue that another way and another perspective for us to grant to this Simon Peter moment is that really Jesus calls Simon Simon when he needs him to be paying attention, right? Because he often goes by Peter. And so if he hears Simon, his ears are already perked up to this different name. It's the same way in which if you go by a nickname and then someone calls you by your real name, you're like, wait, what happened? Am I in trouble? What's going on? It causes you to stop and to listen and to pay attention. I would argue that this is why Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, so that Peter would be listening, that he would be tuned in to what Jesus had to say. And so he does it to draw his attention, but then he goes back to referring to Peter as Peter in 34 because he's making this subtle language shift to let him know that I've told you all the things that you need to hear, and now when I call you Peter, I'm reminding you of your purpose, right? Because Peter, as we all have learned in children's church a long time ago, Peter means Cephas in Aramaic, which is also translated into rock, and this is the same rock that Jesus will build his church upon. And so I would submit that as Jesus calls Peter now, he's foretelling of this denial, but he's also telling him that you still have work to do. Even in the use of this different name, that he is reminding him that you are the rock, that you have purpose, you have calling. And so this is that shift of clarity that goes from Simon to Peter here in this last verse. And so even though Peter will deny Jesus, Jesus still reminds Peter who he is, even with just a simple name change. And is there anybody who can celebrate with me that all it takes for Jesus to provide some clarity sometimes is just the use of a name? That people may have called you unlovable before, but all Jesus has to say is that you are my beloved, for us to know that whatever other people say doesn't matter. Satan may have said that your actions are unforgivable, but all Jesus has to say is that you are redeemed, for us to know that we matter in this world, that we have worth, that we have dignity. All it takes is the use of a name for us to have some clarity about who we are and what we are called to do. And perhaps the good news of this text and the best news of this text all evening is that even though Peter's denial was inevitable, right? Jesus tells it even before it happened. So it was going to happen. It wasn't something that Peter couldn't recover from. And let me say that again for those of you who are still processing what I just said. The good news here is that even though Peter's denial was inevitable, it wasn't something that he couldn't recover from. And the joy of this text is that the inevitable is not unrecoverable. Peter's denial was an inevitable part of Holy Week. It had to happen as part of the story. He made the choice to disown Jesus in the same way that Judas made the choice to betray him, in the same way that Thomas makes the choice to doubt him later on. Those were all their choices, but it was part of the story that was already happening. And even though Peter denies knowing Jesus, Peter still has a place in the upper room, right? That Peter is still there, that Jesus is still telling him about this, that he is still a part of the flock, that he was still chosen in the very beginning. Because even though this denial was inevitable, it wasn't something that Peter couldn't recover from. Jesus still prays for Peter. Jesus still encourages Peter. Jesus still teaches Peter, even though he does the inevitable. Because the inevitable is not unrecoverable. In fact, Jesus would meet the disciples on the beach post-resurrection and confirm this truth for Peter in front of the other 10 who were present. In spite of Peter's betrayal, Jesus reinstates Peter. Jesus helps Peter overcome the challenge of betrayal, reconfirming not once, but 3 times that Peter does indeed love Jesus. For every time that Peter denies knowing Jesus, Jesus gives him another opportunity to say, no, I do love you. Yes, I do love you. There's no fancy declaration that Peter has to offer here in this moment. There's no quick rebuttal. There's no foot in his mouth. It is just simply the truth from the depths of his heart that, yes, I do love you. And finally, Peter's growth leads to some clarity of call as Jesus charges him to then feed my sheep, take care of my sheep, take care of my sheep. That what Peter did was inevitable, but he couldn't not recover from it. That Peter does find some recovery. Peter does find some redemption. Peter does find some reinstatement. And Peter, because he's able to recover to Jesus, we ought know today that that same truth is held for us, that we can also recover from the inevitable. There's no backsliding, no walking away, no trial from Satan that discounts you from the love of God. There's nothing that stands in the way of you in right relationship, of you in reinstatement with God. And there may be someone who's on this stream tonight who's felt like you have moved too far out of God's reach, that you've said too much, that you've done too much, that you've thought too much, that you can't recover from those things. But let me offer you the truth of this text and the truth of the resurrection story, that there is nothing that you can't do that makes you unrecoverable. If Peter found redemption, so can you. This is the joy of the Holy Week story. Jesus travels into Jerusalem being heralded by the same people who would shout, "Crucify him," on Friday. He dines with sinners, he entertains the crowds, and he has Passover with his friends, all while knowing that yes, Judas would betray, that yes, Peter would deny, that yes, Thomas would doubt, and that he would die a gruesome death, but he still does it anyway. He still journeys to the cross, providing a cover of salvation before we even knew that we would need it. It's the umbrella before the storm for us. What challenges lie ahead for you or for me or for us collectively doesn't matter, because Jesus has already covered it for us. He has allowed every stripe upon his body, every thorn crushed into his flesh, every drop of blood to cover you, to cover me, to cover us. He covered every setback from the enemy, every moment of betrayal, every moment of fear, every moment of doubt, every step away. God covered that too. Also that we would not be separated from God. He hung there and sacrificed for us, that we would be connected to him and to God in loving community. There is nothing, there's no inevitable stain of sin that can keep us from recovering. He sacrificed for each one of us so that we would see mercy in his death and redemption in his resurrection. To God be all